My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and again, continuing my Silmarillion Synopsis series, we come to Quintus Silmarillion, Chapter 13 of the Return of the Noldor. Now, this is a long chapter, and it covers a lot of stuff, so I will try to be brief, but this might be a little bit of a long video, so let's go. Okay, so when we last left the Noldor, Feanor had landed in Middle-earth, leaving Fingolfin to find his unhappy way across the Helcaraxe. Now we rejoin Feanor and his people in Middle-earth, and it tells us that when they land, they, of course, burn the ships, and they land in the same region that Morgoth and Ungoliant had their falling out, where Morgoth let forth that really great cry that echoed across Middle-earth, and that region was always known for huge echoes after that. So the noise that the Noldor make and the burning of the ships alerts orcs and other things to their presence, which will end up being significant shortly after. Now, I'm going to be referencing some geography in case you're interested. You don't necessarily need it for the story, but if you are interested in getting a visual idea, have your handy map of Beleriand ready, or you could check out my video on the great battles and kingdoms of Beleriand, which I've done previously, and that'll at least have a map that you can use if you don't have a handy map yourself. I'll link to the video in the description below so you can get a look at it. But basically, Feanor lands near the Firth of Dringist, and he follows it up into the land of Hithlum, and they eventually just kind of make their camp at Lake Mithrin, and the region surrounding that lake is also named Mithrin. So if I use that name interchangeably, that's for a region or for a lake, that's why. But they make their camp there, and while they're there, orcs kind of just set on them all of a sudden before they really had a chance to set up properly in a defensive posture. Despite being taken by surprise and being outnumbered, however, the Noldor quickly become victorious. They really crush the orcs. The fact that they have just recently come from Valinor, and as I mentioned in the previous video on the coming of men, they're like a step above the Dark Elves, just like the Dark Elves are a step above men. So I mean, these guys are pretty bad to the bone. So they really crush the orcs, and they pursue them over the mountains into the Great Plain of Ardgallen, which is north of Dorthonion, which is, you know, north of the mountains where Ungoliant is hiding out. And they keep pursuing them and really just push the orcs all the way back to the gates of Angband and the Thangorodrim. This battle, which is known as the Dagor Nuin Gileath, which basically just means the battle under stars, is the second of the great battles of Beleriand. Now, in that other video that I'll link to with the battles and kingdoms, I think I mentioned that this was the first battle, because I wasn't really counting the one where Thingol was the only one involved and the Noldor hadn't arrived yet. I was mainly counting the ones with the Noldor involved. But anyway, during this battle, after they push the orcs back into the plain of Ardgallen, there's a southern host of orcs, the ones that were besieging Círdan and his people at the havens down further south. They come up to try to ambush and rejoin the other orcs and ambush Feanor's people, but Celegorm, one of Feanor's sons, catches wind of this, and he ambushes the orcs and basically crushes them. The battle as a whole lasts 10 days, and the Noldor are basically just driving the host of Morgoth all the way back to Angband the whole time, and it tells us that of this huge army that Morgoth had built up for the conquering of Beleriand, only a handful of leaves basically is all that came back. But there is some good news for Morgoth, because Feanor, who is kind of in a battle frenzy and thinking he can take on everybody all by himself, gets way ahead of the main army and is trying to come to Morgoth himself in a big hurry. Getting ahead, the host of Morgoth basically turns around and attacks Feanor when he's got really few people with him, and Balrogs come from Angband to help them out, and Gothmog, the lord of the Balrogs, basically beats Feanor to the ground, and just as he's about to really finish him off, the rest of the Noldor come up and save him. But he is mortally wounded. As the other elves are taking his body away from the field of battle, he looks up at the towers of the Thangorodrim, which, when I say towers, That's the word Tolkien uses, but they're really mountains, but they're built, so they're kind of both. So he's looking at the Thangorodrim, and he can tell with the foresight of death, it tells us that they'll never be able to conquer this. And yet he basically lays it on his sons to avenge him for his death, and also to hold to their oath, which they're probably going to have to do anyway because they made such a binding oath on themselves to pursue the Silmarils. But and then when he passes away, it tells us interestingly that when his spirit leaves his body, it's so fiery that his body just burns to ash and blows away on the wind, which tells you something about how potent of a character Feanor was. Now, shortly after this, basically within the same hour as Feanor's death, Morgoth sends messengers basically saying, hey, y'all are tough, okay, you want to like have a parley and come to terms? Now, Maedhros, the eldest son of Feanor, is like, let's take advantage of this. Morgoth was offering even up to a Silmaril to kind of buy peace, basically, and Maedhros is like, I'm not really planning to be, have any real dealings, but let's use this and see if we can gain some additional advantage. Morgoth, of course, is also not planning to play fair, and both sides come with more, with basically an army, not just an ambassadors, so to speak. So, unfortunately, Morgoth brings more, and including Balrogs, and because of that, Maedhros is taken and all of his people killed. And Morgoth takes him to Angband and basically tells the elder Noldor, look, y'all can give this up and either go back to Valinor or way far south of Middle-earth, or you're not going to get Maedhros back. Now, the other Noldor and the other sons of Feanor are thinking, well, Morgoth's pretty much a liar, so we're not going to get Maedhros back either way, and we still have to deal with our oath, so we can't give up the war anyhow, so they can't really leave. So Morgoth basically hangs Maedhros from one of the towers of the Thangorodrim, basically puts his arm in a steel band and like staples it up way high in the mountain. So he's just hanging by his right arm there. And that's kind of the end of the first major confrontation between Noldor and Morgoth. Now, at Lake Mithrim, it tells us that the Noldor ran into some of the Grey Elves who were living in the area, and they greeted each other as long-lost kindred, which of course they basically are, but it mentions that their speech had grown apart in the long ages that, the Noldor had been in Valinor and the Grey Elves had been living in Beleriand, and it took a little while for them to kind of figure out how to communicate with each other, but the Noldor, being, skilled in basically all forms of craftsmanship, including language, pick up the elven tongue of Beleriand pretty quickly and start to communicate. And it tells us that the Grey Elves who were there start to carry news of both the battle that had just been fought and the coming of the Noldor to the Havens and to Menegroth, where Thingol is, and this starts to set in motion a lot of other events. And of course, the Grey Elves tell them of the existence of Thingol and the Girdle of Melian, and the existence, of course, also of Círdan the Shipwright and his people in the further south. Shortly after all these events, Fingolfin's people finally arrive in Middle-earth with the first rising of the moon. And he begins his march, and he's basically unopposed because by this point, Feanor's people have already wiped out most of the orcs, and he's just kind of walking across Beleriand with nothing to challenge him. With the first rising of the sun, he actually comes to Mithrim, and it's not really clear at this point whether Feanor's people are still there or if they're off doing the battle. But anyway, he keeps marching on, eventually comes to the gates of Angband itself, and because Morgoth is basically just hiding out from the host of Feanor and from the newly risen sun, which has risen just as Fingolfin comes to Mithrim, he walks up to the gates of Angband and they just beat on the doors and challenge Morgoth, who of course doesn't come out for obvious reasons. But Fingolfin can't really assault it because the gates are basically impregnable, and so he's like, we might be on top for the moment, but we're not just gonna sit here, so let's go to where we can be a little more fortified. He turns back, goes back to Lake Mithrin, and sets up his camp there as well. And here they meet, Feanor's sons and their people, and there's a lot of tension for the obvious reason that Feanor had betrayed Fingolfin, and the people are not very happy about this. So Feanor's host ends up kind of moving to the south side of the lake, basically just to not have a whole bunch of infighting amongst themselves. Although a lot of them, it tells us, did repent of the betrayal and would have welcomed Fingolfin's host, but for their shame. And it also mentions that despite all the losses Fingolfin experienced in crossing the Helcaraxe, he still had the larger group. And so, if it had come to blows, Fingolfin probably would have had the upper hand if it, really worst came to worst. Morgoth, seeing that there was this dissension in the host of the elves, was rather pleased with himself, so he starts making a whole bunch more smoke and fumes and things and sends them out, and they kind of come to rest over the region of Hithlum and Mithrim and just kind of settle there and make it really yucky and just disgusting. And meanwhile, Fingon, who is Fingolfin's son, and before all this had happened, was really good friends with Maedhros. In fact, you may remember that when Feanor did desert Fingolfin, Maedhros, when they reached the other side, was like, who do we send back for first? Fingon? Because he's good friends with Fingon. And Feanor, of course, was like, we don't need those guys. But Fingon remembers his old friendship with Maedhros, and he resolves to heal the feud by going out and trying to save Maedhros from Morgoth. So he, basically alone goes to the gates of Angband to the Thangorodrim, and he's looking for Maedhros. Now, it also mentioned earlier that when Fingolfin was beating on the doors, that Maedhros was calling out for help, but there was too much noise and they didn't hear him. But now it's just Fingon searching for him. He's looking all over for a way to get into Angband, but he can't find one, and so he just kind of sits down despondently and begins to sing a song that had been made long before in Valinor. And as he's singing, he hears a voice in answer, and it's Maedhros, who had caught the song and from far above was, answering him. And this moment is reminiscent of a few things later on, most pronouncedly probably Frodo and Sam, when Sam starts singing a song in the Tower of Cirith Ungol when he can't find Frodo, and then Frodo kind of sings in answer, but that's kind of neither here nor there. But anyway, Fingon now sees Maedhros, and he's happy about that, but he realizes he's too far up for him to come to, and so he can't rescue him. Maedhros, therefore, basically says, look, I am in complete misery here, just shoot me, put me out of my misery. So Fingon is, about to shoot him, and as he's stringing his bow, he basically says a prayer to Manwë, saying, Lord of the Winds, to whom all birds are dear, speed this arrow. Now, it tells us that his prayer was answered, although it's probably not in the Manwë heard the prayer and therefore answered it since. Manwë had sent the eagles to basically keep an eye on Morgoth because, like Ulmo, he hadn't completely forgotten Middle-earth. And right as he's about to shoot his bow, Thorondor, who is the king of the eagles, comes down to Fingon and basically flies him up to where Maedhros is. So at this point, he's like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. But he can't get the chain out of the rock wall, and he can't break the steel band that's holding Maedhros' arm. So again, Maedhros just begs him, look, just kill me. But instead, what Fingon does, he cuts off Maedhros' right hand so he can get out, and Thorondor then flies them back to Mithrim, where Maedhros can be healed. And incidentally, it tells us that Maedhros, after he is healed, learns to wield his sword in his left hand even more deadly than he had been with his right hand. So you could kind of get the idea that Maedhros has a little bit of a vengeance kick against Morgoth himself now. Fingon's heroism does have its desired effect, and it heals the feud. Maedhros, being probably the wisest of all the sons of Feanor, basically asks forgiveness for what had happened from Fingolfin, and even basically says, look, even if there were no strife between us. Yours would be the rightful kingship because you are now the eldest son remaining of Finwë, and he cedes his, birthright inheritance of the kingship to Fingolfin, although not all of his brothers are very happy about this. So Fingolfin takes the high kingship, and Maedhros and the rest are, some of them are not so happy, but at any rate, they start sending out messengers through the rest of Beleriand to kind of meet up with other people, try to get intelligence and that sort of thing. And of course, they come across Thingol. Thingol is not super happy about the arrival of a whole bunch of princes out of the west who may want more realms because he considers himself lord of all Beleriand. But he is welcoming of Finarfin's people, his sons and whatnot, because Finarfin, you may remember, is wedded to the daughter of Olwe, who was Elwë's or Thingol's brother, and so they're his kin, and that would be Finrod, Felagund, Orodreth, Angrod, and Aignor. So Angrod, who is one of those sons, he is actually the first person to meet with Thingol in Menegroth, and Thingol kind of haughtily tells him, Beleriand is mine, y'all can live here, here, and here, which is basically Hithlum, way out east where there's nobody, and there's really nobody in Hithlum either because it's way far north and mostly deserted and close to Angband. And basically he's telling them they can live in places where there aren't too many of his own people, and he's like, I don't want you messing around with, my folk. Angrod basically takes this message back to the Noldor, who are holding a council, and he's relays this message, and Maedhros is like, well, a lot of the Noldor kind of take this really coldly, which it kind of makes sense. Maedhros, however, just kind of laughs and says, well, he's a king if he can hold his own. I mean, he wouldn't have any realm at all if we hadn't arrived here and beat back the orcs. So, let him do whatever he wants. We're gonna live where we want to live. And then it tells us Caranthir, who is one of the other sons of Feanor, and by far not the nicest, basically says, well, who said that these sons of Finarfin should be our spokesperson to him and all this? And Angrod, because of this, walks out of the council rather angrily. Maedhros basically, puts Caranthir in his place and tries to tell him, don't be like that. But, that it shows that there's still some continuing hostility between these different peoples. And a lot of the Noldor see this and they're like, is Feanor's hot-headedness just going to continue to live on in his sons and cause us trouble? So, there's, again, premonitions here. Now, one thing that's significant, by the way, is when Angrod met with Thingol, it tells us that he did not mention the kinslaying or the exile of the Noldor or the Oath of Feanor. And it tells us that he did this because he's wise-hearted and he's, good. It's not that he's trying to hide it. He's thinking that at this point everything's been forgiven. We don't need to worry about this. But that will end up coming up later and it'll be significant. At any rate, because of the continuing tension between Feanor's people and Fingolfin's, Maedhros decides that he's going to take the host of Feanor and they're going to be in the eastern part of Beleriand and basically hold some of the areas where there's not any mountains for the defense of the elves, while Fingolfin is going to remain in Hithlum and the western parts, and basically Finarfin's sons who are within, Fingolfin's host, they kind of take the middle road, kind of in between, closer to the area of Dorthonion, and basically they just keep watch on Angband from there. Because of Feanor's sons going to the east, Caranthir, who is the most eastward of the entire batch, is the first to run into the dwarves, who, because of Morgoth's incursions into Beleriand, had really stopped doing any kind of traffic or commerce. But once Caranthir is further east, he runs into dwarves, and being the kind of giant, haughty person that he is, doesn't treat them very well. He makes no attempt to disguise the fact that he thinks that they're ugly and kind of silly looking. So they don't really like each other a whole lot, but they do traffic a lot because being Noldor, they're very similar in a lot of ways to dwarves, being connected with Aule and loving craftsmanship and that sort of thing. And because of the, they learn a lot from each other, and because Caranthir is the closest, pretty much all the traffic that goes through Beleriand at this point from the dwarves goes through Caranthir. After 20 years, it tells us Fingolfin holds a great feast of reuniting for all the elves, basically invites everyone from all across Beleriand. Of course, the Noldor show up, many people from Círdan's people show up, but it tells us that only 2 people come out of Doriath to bear tidings from Thingol, so you can still get the idea that Thingol is not necessarily keen on this whole idea of the Noldor being there. But anyway, they have this feast, and it's, by and large a success. After this, and after, some passage of time, Turgon and Finrod, who were friends, even back in Valinor, Turgon being the son of Fingolfin, Finrod being the son of Finarfin, they decide that they're tired of the mountains in the north and they want to, kind of explore Beleriand a bit. They go down the river Sirion, which is the biggest river pretty much in Beleriand, and it ends up telling us much later, not here, but that it's, the most beloved by Ulmo. Well, they're kind of doing their thing wandering around, and while they're near the river Sirion, Ulmo kind of comes and puts them into a deep sleep and gives them dreams, and both of them afterwards are ever looking for places where they can have a hidden stronghold to hold out, because basically you get the idea, it's not explicit what Ulmo's dreams were about, but you get the idea that they're not really certain that the Noldor are going to be able to outlast Morgoth forever. And so they're looking for ways that they can set up and make sure that they can survive when things go bad. As a result of this, Finrod, who later with Galadriel, his sister, goes to visit Thingol in their realm, again, they're welcome there because they're Finarfin's children. Finrod basically tells, well, he notices, of course, Menegroth, which is very hidden, first of all, but also very strong, and it's, this huge system of caverns. And he basically tells Thingol, I like this place, and here's what's on my mind. And he basically kind of tells him he's looking for a place of hidden strength. Thingol then tells him, well, there's some caves near the river Narog, far to the south, and you might make something out of that. So Finrod, sure enough, does go down there, and with the help of dwarves, again, because dwarves are great with working with stone, they build the fortress of Nargothrond, which will become very significant later on in the story. It also tells us that the dwarves at this time give him the necklace called Nauglamir, which has almost magical properties, like it always looks good on whoever it's worn by, and it's basically a dwarven necklace but filled with gems from Valinor, so it's like this really awesome necklace, and that will also figure significantly later in the story. Galadriel, however, remains in Doriath and learns a lot from Melian. We won't really see a whole lot of her for the rest of the story, although she will pop up once or twice more. Turgon never really finds what he's looking for on his own, and eventually Ulmo just comes back to him and, basically appears to him in person and basically says, look, you need to go this way and go back to Syria and go further north, and I'm going to show you a really good place. And he finds the hidden vale in the encircling mountains, which is pretty close to, it's basically the western end of Dorthoni, and there's this little ring of mountains around a valley that nobody had really discovered before. And he finds this, and longing for the elven city of Tirion back in Valinor, he makes plans to basically make a replica of it, but he's doing all this in secret. But that ends up being where he sets up his kingdom, but we'll see more about that later. Now, Morgoth at this point thinks that the Noldor aren't really paying attention, and so he thinks he's going to catch him off guard and try to attack Beleriand again. So he does send an orc host down the passes of Sirion, which is kind of the easiest entry point into Beleriand because almost everything else is mountains. And it tells us that Fingolfin and Maedhros basically come from west and east and just crush the main host of the orcs, while the rest of the elven armies kind of take out the smaller groups that make it southward into Beleriand, and they destroy the army within sight of Angband itself. This is the Dagor Aglareb, or the Glorious Battle. It's the third battle in the Wars of Beleriand, and after this, the elves keep a tighter watch. They're, they basically realize Morgoth isn't just sitting back doing nothing. We should, be very careful here. And the watch that they said is called the Siege of Angband, and it tells us that it lasts for nearly 400 years, although there's never complete peace because there's always like small battles going on at some point. By and large, during this period, there is mostly peace. Fingolfin boasted basically that, Morgoth can never break this without treachery from within. That will come back to haunt him. But they can't beat Angband either or regain a Silmaril, so they really can't make progress at the same time. Morgoth, of course, because basically he's got all these mountains down below, he can send people up north, and he basically uses this to send spies into Beleriand and occasionally capture Noldor. And it tells us that the elves that he can capture, he daunts with his eyes and his power, and basically they become unwilling slaves, whether they're with him or not. It's like wherever they go, they feel like they're compelled to do his will, and this will also become significant much later on. 100 years after the Dagor Aglareb, Morgoth tries again. He sends an orc host down the western coast, trying to come into Hithlum from the west, and Fingon basically finds out what they're doing and comes on them and just drives them into the sea. This was a smaller battle, so it's not counted among the great battles and isn't really given a name, but it does show Morgoth. The orcs aren't really standing up to the Noldor. This is not really working out for him, so he starts to think about how he can devise, you know, better weapons of war, let's say. And in that process, he devises dragons. And 100 years after this other battle, we get another battle that comes about because Glaurung, who is the first of the fire dragons or fire drakes, or in Elvish Uruloki, he comes forth, and he's only half grown, it tells us, and not completely grown into his armor yet. But the elves at first flee before him because he's this really nasty critter, until Fingon with his people come with horsed archers and ring him about and start shooting at him. And because he doesn't have enough armor and he's not full grown, he can't really withstand their arrows, and so he flees back to Angband. Now the elves don't really recognize the full significance of this, and so they're kind of just happy that they beat it off, but it will get a lot worse for them later. Morgoth in the meanwhile is kind of unhappy because apparently Glaurung came forth without really Morgoth's permission and disclosed his existence a little bit too soon. But after this, there were basically 200 years of relative peace, again with really small battles here and there on the borderlands essentially, but nothing major happens for another 200 years. So that's the first adventures of the Noldor after they return to Beleriand. Now the next chapter in the Silmarillion is of Beleriand and its realms, and basically it just describes who lives where, what they're doing, that sort of thing. And that's kind of already covered in that video I mentioned earlier, which I'm linking to below, about the great battles and the kingdoms. Now the battles part will have spoilers for further chapters down the line, but if you just want to check out the realms and stuff and get a synopsis of that, you can use that video. So that'll give you some idea of the next chapter. So I won't be doing a new video for Quinta Silmarillion chapter 14 because I've basically already covered that. So the next one I'll cover will be Quinta Silmarillion chapter 15. So the next video will be on that topic. In the meantime, please do like this video and share it around if you found it useful or interesting. If you are looking to find some Tolkien trivia in your life, you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. You can also subscribe to the channel here, and don't forget to click that bell icon. You can support me at Patreon over here, and you can find 2 of my previous videos here. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.